Hey, welcome. Thanks for joining us, you all. We've got a great conversation here. I am Jenna Talbot, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors, and I have the pleasure of talking today with Liz Willen, Editor-in-Chief of the Hechinger Report, Caroline Howard, Executive Editor at Forbes, and Chris Quintana, Higher Education Reporter at USA Today. And today we're really going to talk about how COVID-19 has, of course, not only upended the way we learn and work, but upended the way that news has been created and is playing out. So we're going to jump into a conversation. We've got 25 minutes, so we want to be prompt to make sure we get right into the issues. But of course, you'll hear as we talk, not just only acknowledging the impact of COVID-19 and how stories are being shaped, but also acknowledging the racial reckoning that our country is facing. And this has been, as we reflect back on the year, there's been a lot of major changes. And so you'll hear us talk not only about COVID, but also talk about important movements like Black Lives Matter, talk about the political dynamics at play. So we're going to jam as much as we can into this conversation. But Caroline and Liz and Chris, let's start perhaps just with like a quick pre-COVID look. I'm curious, what were the stories and topics that you thought really defined the state of education before COVID? And then how has that, of course, changed in the last year? Liz, maybe we'll start with you.
I'll be happy to jump in. I mean, the pandemic in a lot of ways couldn't have come at a worse time. The backdrop was that public education was already facing a big crisis. We had a U.S. Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who was pushing for solutions for private schools and for charter schools and for school choice. At the same time, we had crumbling infrastructure, teacher shortages all over the country, and a real sense that public education needed a lot better funding. And also the signature issue for us was the enormous inequality in U.S. education and the schools that got the most funding versus those that got the least funding, also the problems in large urban systems. So when the coronavirus hit for K-12, there was already a backdrop of enormous problems. And for higher ed as well, there's big issues looking forward about public funding for the flagship schools and about the survival of small liberal arts schools going forward, plus huge enrollment drops in community colleges. So we already had a lot of issues. Then we had the coronavirus, and it's been one crisis after another.
Chris, what were the big things you were watching pre-March of last year?
I would echo Liz's, comments about the financial health of universities, right? We were seeing that in the public sector, definitely concerned about the smaller private colleges and kind of what their future would be. And when you look at enrollment, declining, that certainly hurts institutions that are reliant on tuition and not only that, but also the other services that come with like in-person learning, like dorms and parking lots and meal plans, and I'm sure we're going to touch back on that at some point. But the one that also kind of thematically captured a lot of the ire, I think, for higher ed was the Varsity Blues scandal. And that was actually approaching right around a year when the pandemic broke in a big way. And the only reason I know that is because I put out a big kind of retrospective project around that time. I talked with a couple of leaders from selective universities about what they thought the impact of Varsity Blues would be. And then we were kind of right into the pandemic right after that. So there were already a lot of questions about fairness in college admissions and who is a college education for and kind of where do you get to go? And so I think there was a lot of frustration in that space that will come back, but the conversation around COVID kind of superseded.
Caroline, how about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'll pick it up. So I would say that our coverage on Forbes maybe was divided into two areas. The first one, I think, to what Liz was talking about and what Chris was talking about was this whole narrative of education in crisis, and that the testing, that would be the SATs, that would be teacher pay, that would be college access, that would be the impact of DeVos and administration. And so there was that part. And then there was the other part where people were talking a lot about innovation in education. And what I think that COVID and the year of 2020 has done is they've thrown both really into high relief, because what was a crisis in 2019 has only accentuated, it's only thrown into high relief, things like teacher pay and accountability, the SATs. And what it's also done is it's taken the innovative part, which is mostly taken the form of remote learning, and normalized it, obviously, because so many children are doing that, and taking it from sort of hypotheses, imagination, and test cases into practice on a mass scale. And what is the upshot of that? And those have become
very little training and almost no sense of warning. It was just
no, like no one was prepared
we were
for it.
homeschoolers and a virtual online learning, and that was that.
Right. And then there are conversations that seem to me, and Chris might be in a better position as is Liz, like the whole charter school issue, which in New York City in particular and other cities was such a fertile ground for debate, has become like nobody's even talking about charter schools. It's so sort of besides the fact. And so what was a crisis has now become more of a crisis. What was considered to be innovative is now normalized, and things that were such hot topics of debate seem to have been left behind.
Yeah, I would argue that what we really need to all be focused on now in terms of thinking ahead is how far behind kids have fallen this year of remote learning. And even before this, there were national tests and studies out showing that students were behind in math starting out the year. Students of color were also falling way behind in reading. Now we've had a full year of disruption, and we're not sure. Some kids were able to go to school in person, some were able to go to school 1 or 2 days a week, some were able to form pods. People were trying all kinds of different things, but we really don't know yet what the learning loss is going to look like. And there's some serious implications around that I think are going to be the big story going forward. One of the
and I would agree with that. And I do think, another story that has really come to the forefront is really mental health.
Absolutely.
That is because of the remote learning and the isolation and the falling behind and the digital divide, and also because of the racial reckoning and the new I would say sort of like this mass recognition that business is normal and crises is normal is no longer the case. And we really need to confront these things in real time, because that is, I think, one of the most important factors in education is that kids get one shot. They get one shot at second grade and they get one shot at 8th grade. And so there's no room really for mistakes. It's a person's life we're talking about.
Well, that's maybe a great, we can kind of stay on this topic for a little while as we think about who's been impacted the most, right? And we talk about our Black children from Latinx communities. I mean, EWA, the Ed Writers Association, had a fascinating kind of state of the beat report come out a couple of weeks ago. And one of the findings were that 80% of education reporters today are white. And I'm curious, I know Liz, the Heckender reports had a longstanding focus on issues of education equity, but we have these kind of twin crises of a global health pandemic and racial reckoning. What are you seeing, what's been the impact on how we're covering communities of color, particularly not just looking at who's being impacted in this moment, but at large, how are we thinking about some of these issues?
Well, for us, in some ways, that we haven't changed our thinking about it, but we make a huge effort to get voices from all over the country. And what's hard for us in all kinds of diverse voices and from teachers, from kids, from principals. Of course, one of the most difficult things right now for all reporters everywhere is the lack of ability to travel in person and spend time in classrooms. For us, everything was about spending time in classrooms, and that's how we sort of pride ourselves on doing our reporting, campuses and classrooms, and that has been far more fraught, far more difficult, and in many cases impossible. We have found ways to do that. We have also found ways to be invited on Zoom calls in classrooms. I know John Marcus has traveled. He's one of our higher ed editors and writers, and he's traveled widely throughout New England wearing a mask and visiting campuses and students and whenever possible. But we also are deeply involved in the whole question of how education is going to change going forward as a result of the Black Lives protests this year, how teachers are thinking about it, what kinds of discussions they're having about it, what kind of support there is for students who may really want to talk about it but are no longer in person and have the ability to share that with teachers and their students. So all really important issues, and it's exacerbated, kind of like we're dealing with two crises simultaneously. Chris, you've probably done quite a bit of reporting on this as well. I'm curious what you're finding.
Yeah, when we're talking about students of color or first generation students or those coming from homes where they would be eligible for Pell Grants, right? I think the concern we had seen in the past is just kind of what supports are in place once these students are actually enrolled. And I had to kind of take a step back last year and just write about what are the effects if these students don't even enroll in college in the first place, because they're a lot of students were talking about gap years or waiting because they were apprehensive about online college. And what I found pretty quickly is advocates for college completion said, for a lot of these students, if we don't get them in the door right after they graduate high school, their chances of success go way down. And that's not just, like a 4-year degree. It's sort of any post-secondary credential, right? And so I think that was part of the conversation that we had to zoom back a little bit on is some of the things we had been talking about, supports in place and helping people achieve within the academy, kind of had to be zoomed out and think, well, how do we even get people into these places to begin with? And so that's something that I'm focusing on now. And there are troubling signs out there. The completion rates for the FAFSA are still down, and that's indicative of falling enrollment. But also, it's indicative of students who may need federal financial aid, right? And so that when we're talking about the lost generation, I mean, it kind of is happening across the sectors, right? It's happening in schools and happening in students who don't enroll and don't go to seek out that extra education.
And Chris, how have you, to Liz's point around not being able to be in schools or be on campuses, how we've got great data. You mentioned NCAN's, FAFSA tracker, and I know National Student Clearinghouse has come out with some data. But how have you been looking at the human element of this? How have you been able to identify sources and folks to talk to that kind of really bring some of these challenges to light?
At the risk of perhaps raising some eyebrows from my editor, I spend a lot of time on Twitter and kind of other web forums where you would expect to see some students. There's a Reddit community entirely focused on applying to college, and they kind of tell each other what their chances are and how maybe to build up that application. On Twitter, you often see people complaining about their online classes, and you can commiserate with them about that aspect of it, and then kind of get into the other parts of the learning experience that may be lacking. And also, just from a reporting perspective, it's been really hard getting on campuses. Normally, it's the sort of thing where colleges love to have people, kind of see what they do and how they do it, and talk to their students and talk to their professors. And now I think there's necessarily a hesitation to have people, especially when a lot of colleges are trying to, create this like bubble model, right? So I was only able to get out to one campus this last year, and it felt really great to be there and see people in person, but it certainly has made it a little bit more challenging to find the real kind of lived experiences. And so I'm trying to find those online resources, and I always just like to say my Twitter DMs are open, and I'm happy to hear your stories. So it's been my approach so far. If anyone has a better approach, I'm happy to hear it.
Well, and Caroline, maybe thinking about different approaches. So Forbes recently announced you're opening parts of the platform up to journalist entrepreneurs. You've obviously had a really deep contributor network, but maybe zooming out beyond education, just talk about, how might expanding the voices we have on media platforms shape or change the issues that we're paying attention to?
Exactly. I mean, and I think that that's what Liz and Chris were getting to. It's about, finding the sources, but it's also about finding the author. And so, and what lens the author brings to their story, and in fact, whatever that story might be. And so, to your point, yeah, Forbes has, staff journalists, obviously, that cover education. But we also have a roster of contributors that come to us with various beats, from K to 12 to higher education, to equity, to policy, to to funding, and so we already had the groundwork for that, and we have doubled down in the past year again to point to the residents of the Black Lives Matter protests. And the impact on the education community. We have doubled down to find new voices and really look for a diversity in storytelling. But the new program that you were mentioning, we're calling them journalist entrepreneurs, and it's a way to take that philosophy of a multitude of voices that appear on our platform. And bring it to this resurgence of newsletters, which everybody is jumping into that game right now. And so we see it as a way to expand our audience and our authors, in a sense that when someone's on a platform, success obviously comes from the quality of the story, but it also comes from traffic that you get, which comes down to, SEO and how a story is trending. But that doesn't really speak to very deep and engaged communities, which newsletters will bring to the fore, because newsletters, people are invested in a topic and they're invested in an author, and it comes direct to them and it's really written for them. And there's a much more authentic kind of back and forth relationship. So the newsletters, we feel, and onboarding these new journalist entrepreneurs is, a way for exposure for them, on our platform and on our newsletters, to provide that kind of depth and richness of reporting, high quality, using the scale of Forbes. And obviously, and this is really important for journalists right now, when the landscape for professional opportunity is shrinking. And that's money. And so, it is a revenue source. And so, so we feel super positive about it, because we want to be able to use the authority of these authors and the scale of what the Forbes platform can bring, and bring it to the newsletters.
Yeah. And I know you're just getting started, but are there a few topics you're excited about that you've seen so far that people are bringing up that they're planning to start?
Well, I think that access and equity and diversity in education are really big, as well as, as what I mentioned earlier, which is, ed tech, right? And the thought and some of the more compelling, pitches really is thinking about sort of taking education and not just transferring it as it stands digitally, but actually figuring out how to use digital as a whole new medium of learning, again, which brings us back to COVID. And so, there's a very ripe community of people who were previously involved in ed tech, and also everybody who's been thrown into the deep end because of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, on that thread, I mean, this is South by Southwest, right? So we've got to spend a little bit more time talking about technology and innovation. You know, it's interesting. At the beginning of the pandemic, Whiteboard did a media analysis looking at coverage of ed tech, kind of pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. So we looked at, I think it was March, April 2019 versus March, April 2020. And perhaps not surprising at all, there was like a 69% increase in the number of stories around education technology. And you were seeing big daily news outlets talk about ed tech in a way that we've never seen before. Now, a lot of that has been specifically just on that transition to remote learning early on. But I'm curious from the three of you, what are the big stories you're following now? You know, Caroline, you made the point that we've kind of gone from innovation to common practice, right? A reality that everyone's using technology in some format. I probably some great and some less than ideal circumstances, but what are the big stories when it comes to education technology that the three of you are watching?
Oh my God, I can tell you right off the bat, right immediately, that there's enormous concern over how inadequate online learning has been, both on the K-12 level and on the higher ed level. I just published a story, it's on our site today, that looked back at a year later for college freshmen, what happened to them. They were agonizing about after their senior year was turned upside down and online. Should they go to college? And the actual experience for many of them of studying online has been, in many cases, frustrating, in some cases, impossible. In one case, the student was so isolated in her dorm room at the University of Pittsburgh, the quality of, she saw no teachers, no in-person teachers, no in-person classes, such a diminished experience that she decided not to go back. I think that is a really frightening trend for higher education. And some of the innovators I spoke with, people like Michelle Weiss of Strata, said, you know, we have to fix this quality of online learning. You have to have some real thinking in instructional design and platforms that are engaging and exciting for students, or you are going to lose them. After this first year, I think for a lot of students, it will be interesting to see how many decide not to come back. And the implications for this, I'm talking right now only for higher ed, although I think a lot of this can be said for K-12, are huge. I think there may be some misconceptions that higher ed's problems are just kind of a pandemic year bump, but long term, there's a lot to be worried about. Their finances are terrible, especially for small private and less select institutions. If a lot of these students don't return because they've been unsettled or unsatisfied with the online learning experience, for the private schools, it's devastating. State education budgets, if they continue to fall in the pandemic finances, that has enormous implications for flagships and state universities as well. And all of this, what this does is it boosts the equity gap, makes it wider, and it gives university and college admissions more incentives to accept students who can pay in full and who are at the top of the income scale. And it leads to even more of the kind of inequality and disparities in who gets educated that we've been writing about for years. So I think a lot of it does go back to what kinds of learning platforms have been can be offered, but also none of it takes the place for the four-year population, and that is not the majority of students in our country. But for those students, the quality of what they've had in terms of their experience online and not being exposed to in-person learning and the traditional joys and uncertainty and mystery of being a college student could be potentially devastating long-term for higher ed.
Chris, I'm curious on that point. Are you seeing, we haven't, Liz made the point that our traditional four-year kind of brick and mortar 18-year-old student is not the norm anymore. We have institutions, like CSU Global or Southern New Hampshire, ASU, that have built intentionally for online and for learners that are older, that are juggling family priorities. Are you seeing any of what we maybe call more traditional 4 years look to them for tips on how to do remote learning well and how to potentially transform the way they think about online learning? Are you seeing any examples of that?
Of turning to, I'm sorry, one more time.
Turning to some of the like online first institutions like a Southern New Hampshire CSU Global that's figuring this out. To Liz's point, trying to make the jump overnight, right, is not the grand vision for the role that technology can play in supporting learning. So I'm curious if you're seeing institutions worried about delivering a poor experience, looking to others that maybe have figured it out pre-pandemic.
Yeah, I wish that I was kind of on some of those backroom chats where I'm told these conversations happen, but I'm not always entitled to it. But I think the challenge has been for a lot of colleges. I think there's this perception that it's just like a switch that you could hit, right, and that you would just like transcribe, whatever the professor was doing in the classroom would just be beamed out. And as Liz was saying, students are really frustrated with that experience. And we're just even talking about concurrent like instruction. And, if a student is in China and they have like, this is the only time that their class is available, like, is that really fair? And just even talking more broadly about the issue of internet access, right? Like that has been something that has been kind of coming up here and there and was mainstreamed in a big way when all of a sudden, the expectation was if you wanted to be a student, you not only had to, have the grades and the desire to be there, but then you also had to kind of take on this own infrastructure for yourself if it wasn't there already. And so a lot of the students I spoke to, I remember one was telling me that he was trying to navigate his classes like on his iPhone, like his iPhone 7 or something. And I'm just trying to imagine like, looking at some of those learning platforms on something like this big, it seems really hard to fathom. So that's something that I'm trying to pay more attention to in the future.
Yeah, divide is hugely important. We didn't touch on that, but I think that's a very big part of the story and what we've been finding in our reporting. The lack of connectivity, the lack of device. Not all students have that. I mean, we've done stories about students studying, trying to take classes on their mom's cell phone in a parking lot at a McDonald's in Mississippi. And there's been, a big rush from school districts to hurry up and get the students the devices that they need so they can study online on K-12 level. And in higher ed, a couple of stories that we wrote about the students who didn't have laptops led to people donating them. I mean, it's the disparity is wild and wide.
Well, I had a feeling our time was going to go very fast. We're going to have to wrap up our conversation today, but I'd like to do this. We've talked a lot about the challenges of the last year. Maybe in one sentence for each of you, what is the one story you're excited about to follow in 2021? Are there little spots of optimism we might be able to leave folks with? Caroline, I'll let you go first.
Well, I'm excited about our new president and Biden. And that's a whole new narrative that we have before us. And so we have different funding stories coming up, different spending stories coming up, different stories about the value of vocational training, educational pathways to careers. I think that what the president brings to the table is just a whole new menus of stories for us to explore.
True.
Liz?
No, I agree with that. It's a whole new era where there'll be more emphasis on public education and less on private options and alternatives. But I would say if I could use one word, I think that I'm most excited about, it's the word reopening. And that's classrooms, campuses, all of it.
Amen to that. Chris, how about yourself?
Yeah, I want to see what changes actually stick and kind of what accommodations we've made for the coronavirus that actually may be positive long term. The one that comes to mind is the test optional movement in the college admission space, right? Like that was a conversation that was kind of chugging along and it was mainstreamed in a big way when you couldn't take a test anymore to get into the college. And we're already seeing it from very selective institutions. UVA just announced that it was going to extend its test optional window. We've seen a few other selective institutions extend it as well. I'm curious about how flexible colleges will remain in offering online and in-person courses for students who may be disabled or have otherwise issues in getting to a campus. And I'm curious, how many of these changes may actually could be positive in the long term. So that's where I'm keeping my eyes.
Great. Well, you know, I could sit here and nerd out all afternoon, so I'm sorry to cut this short, but for those watching, Caroline, Liz, and Chris are all on Twitter. They're all accessible. If you've got great, you can kind of continue this conversation and hear what's top of mind and what they're following. So check them out on Twitter. Thank you all for listening in, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully in Austin next year with some live music and barbecue.
Reopening.
Thanks, Jenna.
Fingers crossed.
Bye.